Today, most Americans, asked for their general observations and reactions to the First World War, tend to use exactly the same vocabulary as do most Britons. In other words, they use words like waste and futility, words which are both hackneyed and banal. Hackneyed because they're cliches, and banal because they trip off the tongue far too lightly, given the scale and suffering of what lies behind them. If this was a war that was indeed wasteful and futile, then it was also useless. And I stress that word useless precisely because some of you may feel that I yoke together two topics which do not naturally cohere. Today, Clausewitz's most famous aphorism is that war is the continuation of policy by other means. In other words, it's a utilitarian definition of war. It implies that war has a purpose. And if you believe that the First World War did not have any purpose, then what the hell is the point of bringing to its analysis a Prussian who'd been dead 73 years by the time it broke out? Now, some people believe there is no point in that exercise. John Keegan, in his History of Warfare, published in 1993, a book which, among other things, set out to topple Clausewitz from his throne in military studies, wrote, "Policy played no part in the conduct of the First World War worth mentioning. The First World War was, on the contrary, an extraordinary, a monstrous cultural aberration." Perhaps we should therefore not be surprised that when Keegan turned his attentions to the First World War itself, a book which he published in 1998, he could only conclude, somewhat feebly in my view, these are his words, the First World War is a mystery. Its origins are mysterious, so is its course. I'm tempted to say that the mystery is of Keegan's own making. But John Keegan is in good company. David Stevenson, a major scholar of the First World War and a professor at the London School of Economics, and indeed a product of Corpus Cambridge as I am myself, a little bit younger than me, I'm afraid. David Stevenson's book on the First World War, published in 2004, uses Clausewitz as the framework for his analysis of the war. He states, in terms which echo Keegan's, of the war, no one was in overall control in Clausewitz's basic sense that neither side could dictate the responses of the other, and both played wild cards. Now, Stevenson is too good a historian not to acknowledge that the governments, as he put it, seem more purposive, the armed forces more adaptive, and the ordinary soldiers and civilians more willing and informed participants than once was thought. But he nonetheless concludes with what he calls the deeper insight. And these are his words again. The deeper insight is that the war was still a tragedy, a vast and avoidable waste. Now, if the Clausewitzian paradigm to the First World War throws up no more profound conclusions than those two, that the war was on the one hand a mystery and on the other hand a tragedy, then we might cynically ask, why bother? Why should taking the name of Clausewitz and sticking it in front of interpretation add to or detract from its legitimacy when it probably does little more than beef up the confidence of the historian who so appropriates the great man's name? I think there are two responses to that question. The first is a response relevant to those interested in the theory of war, and the second is a response to those interested specifically in military history. For those in the first group, the need to pursue Clausewitz's relevance to our understanding of the First World War rests precisely on Clausewitz's ambitions for his own work. On War aspired to produce an interpretation of war which stretched beyond Clausewitz's own experience. And his success in that endeavour is itself testimony as to why we continue to read the book today, and why, indeed, those most unscientific of scientists, that is to say, political scientists, even read it themselves. If On War cannot help us to comprehend the First World War, then that is a pretty serious indictment given Clausewitz's own intentions and ambitions for his book. For those in the second group, that is to say, military historians, the relevance of Clausewitz to our understanding of the First World War rests precisely on the fact that in 1914, his work was more widely read and appreciated than at any other stage since von Krieger had first been published between 1832 and 1834. In Germany, a fresh edition, numbered the fifth, had been published in 1905 with a foreword by the Chief of the Prussian General Staff, Alfred von Schlieffen. As Tony Echevarria has argued, Clausewitz was reflected and regularly cited on all sides in the principal controversies related to the conduct of war in the pre-1914 German army. In France, a new translation of On War had appeared between 1886 and 1889, and most, and I think actually I would say most, I think all of Clausewitz's historical works were published in French in the 1890s or in the early 1900s. And as a result, and as in Germany, his work permeated the writings on strategy and tactics produced by the principal military theorists of the day within France. In Britain, J.J. Graham's translation, which was first published in 1873, the first English edition, English language edition, had sales which were dismal even by the dismal standards of the first German edition. From the top of my head, I think about 200 copies over the next 20 years. In 1908, that translation was relaunched in a fresh edition, and it carried a foreword by Colonel F.N. Maud. He wrote, Clausewitz's work has been the ultimate foundation on which every drill regulation in Europe, except our own, that is to say Britain's, has been reared. It is this ceaseless repetition of his fundamental ideas to which 1/2 of the male population of every continental nation has been subjected for 2 to 3 years of their lives, which has tuned their minds to vibrate in harmony with his precepts. However much Maud veered more to the mystical than to the rational in his writings, here it would seem is the justification for yoking Clausewitz to the First World War. The trouble is that the fundamental idea to which compulsory military service had attuned the adult male population of military age in Europe did not include, or did not often include, the one idea with which we now associate Clausewitz, that is to say, the relationship between war and policy. Before 1914, armies did not read Clausewitz as John Keegan and David Stevenson have read it. Their attention was devoted less to the relationship between strategy and policy, about which Clausewitz has in fact said remarkably little, and most of that was confined to books 1 and 8 of the 8 books of On War. And they devoted much more attention to the relationship between strategy and tactics, the relationship which is central to all the intervening books of On War, and the one with which soldiers were naturally more engaged.